Okay, so we are going to talk about the respiratory system today. So last time we were together, we talked about the immune system. Time before that, we talked a little bit about cardiovascular system and blood and things like that. And so this set of notes goes along really well with the blood. And so we're going to maybe just review a little bit when we talk about the blood stuff for a second. So when we talk about the respiratory system primarily is going to get oxygen into our bodies and get carbon dioxide out of our bodies. And so we'll talk about how that happens and stuff in a second. But why is that important? Well, why do we need oxygen? I mean, you think about like how much our body and the energy of our body is invested in getting oxygen into our body. Well, the reason why we have to have oxygen is because oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. And so if you don't have oxygen going to your mitochondria, then you can't take the electrons off the electron transport chain, which means the new electrons can't come through that have energy, and they can't pump the hydrogens, and you can't make ATP, and then your cells will die. And if your cells die, and enough of your cells die, then you will die. So make sure and breathe, or you will die. There. That was very important lesson for today. Breathing is important. On the other side, as we produce ATP, we produce carbon dioxide. So it's like exhaust from your car, or it's like some kind of waste product that comes from this process that is necessary for our bodies. So we have to have ATP. The way our bodies are set up, as we make ATP, we produce carbon dioxide. So that becomes toxic in our bodies. The primary thing that our body does with that, we'll talk more about in a few minutes, but it will take the carbon dioxide, hook it onto water, and make carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is an acid, which means if that builds up in your bloodstream, then your pH goes down, and then that can start causing brain damage, and it causes problems with your kidneys and all kinds of physiological issues. So our pH has to be balanced, just like our sugar does, and our blood pressure and oxygen levels and all that stuff. So we have all kinds of mechanisms to help balance it out. But one of the main ways we balance out the pH and our CO2 levels is through breathing. And so, of course, that's what we're going to talk about today. So ATP is important. We have to have ATP for nervous system functions. We have to have ATP to keep our heart pumping. We have to have ATP to keep our lungs breathing and our digestive system digesting. And we have to have ATP to drive on the freeway and yell at people that cut us off. We have to have ATP to play basketball and go hiking and feed your dog and, all those things. So those things are important. And so we have to have ATP. If you don't have ATP, then you're in big trouble. So respiratory system is important. All right, so let's kind of jump into how this happens. So we talk about the respiratory system. Of course, just like all the other systems in our body, the respiratory system is prepared and set up in a very specific way to kind of help with this process. So the primary function of respiratory system is regulate pH, get oxygen to our cells, get rid of CO2, which is kind of the same thing as that. We also use it to make sounds. So just like I demonstrated at the start of this lecture, like singing is very important, helps with smell, that's good too. So all these things are important. The way that the respiratory system works is we're going to have external respiration, internal respiration, and cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is the part where we make ATP with O2 and we release carbon dioxide. And then these two are the parts where we get the oxygen to the cells and CO2 away from the cells, and then get it either into or out of our bodies, depending on which we're talking about, if that makes sense. So in order to do this, we have to bring a lot of air into our body, into our bloodstream. But to just take a giant volume of air and try to shove it into your bloodstream isn't going to work. So basically what we have to do is we breathe in a big volume of air, and then we break this big volume of air into little teeny tiny pieces, each of which will end up in the tiny little microscopic sacs that make up the lungs called the alveoli. So in order to do this, we start at the mouth or the nose or both, and we breathe in. So those bring in a big volume of air. That's going to collect in this area behind the mouth called the pharynx. So the pharynx has three parts. The upper part of the pharynx is called the nasopharynx. The part behind the mouth is called the oropharynx. and then the part where it connects to the larynx is called the laryngopharynx. And so the pharynx, the air will go into the pharynx, and then it will come down, and the tube splits. So when we get down to the bottom of the pharynx, basically where just down below the epiglottis, the tube's going to split into two parts. And one of the parts is going to go posterior, and that tube's going to go down in the stomach. And of course, that's what, when we talk about the digestive system, that's what we'll talk about then. But then the anterior part is where the air goes to breathe. And of course, sometimes we get air in our stomach, so you drink a big soda or you chug something or whatever, and then you have to burp really loud, which of course only rude males do that kind of thing. Not proper young women would never think of doing things like that. But yeah, so you can get air down in your digestive tract. Of course, that happens. But to breathe, it has to go down in the lungs. So then we're going to go down through the larynx, which is where the vocal cords are, and the voice box and Adam's apple and that kind of stuff. And then we go into the trachea, and we'll talk more about these as we go on. But we go into the trachea, and then the trachea is going to split into two branches. One branch goes to the right lung, the other branch goes to the left lung. And then, of course, then those branches split into smaller branches, and then those branches split into smaller branches and smaller, until we get to the tiny, teeny tiny little sacs called the alveoli. And there's going to be specific anatomy associated with each one of these, but the final step when you get to the alveoli is that those alveoli are lined with one layer of simple squamous epithelium. That's all they are. And so they're super duper thin, super duper fragile, which is great because they are so thin, then the gases, the oxygen and carbon dioxide, can just simply diffuse, follow their diffusional gradient into and out of the blood, respectively. And so as long as there's more oxygen in the air we breathe than there is in our blood, and this whole system's set up the way it's supposed to, then the oxygen will simply diffuse into the blood, and then carbon dioxide just vice versa. And so that's really great because it makes the system really, really efficient. The problem with that is that the alveoli, being such a small, thin layer of simple squamous epithelium, are also very, very fragile. So it's really, really easy for them to break or get damaged or torn or build up scar tissue or fill with fluid or whatever. And so we have a whole bunch of things built around the alveoli to help protect from infections and help protect from fluid buildup and protect from, all kinds of things that will prevent this system from working efficiently. And so we'll talk about all that stuff in a second. And then so on the other side of the alveoli, then right next to the alveoli, then you have, because the alveoli are one layer of simple squamous epithelium, thinner than tissue paper, super duper thin, fragile. And right next to it, then you have one thin layer of simple squamous epithelium, which is the capillaries. And so all the gases have to do is just diffuse across those layers to get into and out of the blood. So it's super duper great as long as everything's working the way it's supposed to. Okay, so nasal cavity or oral cavity. So if you go in the nose, you start with the nasal cavity. So the nostrils and then the nasal cavity. The nasal conchae. This is lined with mucous membranes, and the tissue is a pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. And then intermingled with the pseudostratified cells, you have goblet cells. And so the goblet cells are going to produce the mucus or mucus producing cells. And so, of course, we all know there's mucus in the nose. And then the cilia will sweep the mucus towards the pharynx, and then we can swallow it down to the digestive system, or we can blow our nose or spit it out or whatever, cough it up or whatever. If it goes down in the stomach, then it's so acidic down there that the acid will just eat up any kinds of germs or dust or whatever and get rid of it. So that's great. Or then, of course, if you blow your nose or whatever, then you just throw it in the garbage or trash or toilet or something. So the nose is going to warm the air, it's going to moisten the air, it's going to filter incoming stuff. And so all that's important. So breathing through your nose is great, helps clean it and get rid of germs. But that's part of the reason why nasal mucus and boogers and stuff have so much bacteria in them, is because the whole purpose of that is it's like an air filter to get rid of that junk going in. So there's dirt and all kinds of germs and things. But this picture just kind of illustrates it. So you see the nasal cavity and then the pharynx back here. And then, So that's if you breathe through your nose. If you just breathe through your mouth, then of course you don't go through the nose. And so then you just start with the oral cavity, but the same kind of thing. So this picture here just shows These are the pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. So it's just one of the kinds of epithelium. Pseudo meaning false, not real stratified layer, but it looks stratified because the nuclei are not all at the same level. And then on top you have the cilia, and then intermingled with the pseudostratified ciliar cells, then you have mucus cells or goblet cells that produce the mucus. And then that's just a histology slide that shows the same thing. So this is a pattern that we're going to see. The same kind of thing is going to continue down through the upper part, a lot of the upper parts of the respiratory system, where we see these cilia cells, and so it's going to be important. Again, it mostly helps filter out pathogens and particulate that's in the air that we breathe. Okay. So this is kind of an interesting idea. So as you continue down, we'll talk more about the oral cavity in a second. But as you continue down into the trachea and stuff, and in the bronchi, you're going to see the same kinds of cells. You're going to see cilia in there. In the case of the cilia that are down in those parts of the respiratory tract, the cilia on those are going to make a wave-like motion that will move the mucus up towards the larynx. And so any kind of dirt and stuff that gets down in the trachea or the upper parts of the bronchi will get trapped in the thick mucus, and then your body will move it up there. One of the interesting things that happens when people breathe a lot of particulate, for example, a person who smokes a lot, the carcinogens and the toxins and stuff that are in the smoke and the particulate that's in the smoke that you breathe actually damage and destroy the cilia on the surface of your pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. And so then what happens is your body still keeps producing the mucus, but the mucus can't move up towards the back of your throat. And so because of gravity, it starts to settle down in your lungs. And then what do people who smoke a lot have to do? They cough a lot. So then the smoker's cough is a result of that cilia not working and taking care of its job. And so then you have that kind of idealistic, I guess, sounding cough that we associate with people that smoke. But it's kind of interesting. Anyways, but that's why that happens. It's kind of cool. And of course, in a short, like if it's just an acute sort of situation, the cilia can actually be repaired. But if this continues for long periods of time, then it can lead to emphysema. It can cause COPD. You can have other problems, lung cancer, and things like that, which are, obviously much more serious. But it is kind of interesting to see how that works. Okay, so we talked about that. So the larynx then, so then if we go in the oral cavity, we skip the nasal cavity, we end up in the pharynx, and then the pharynx continues down to the laryngopharynx and then into the larynx. So the larynx is the part that a lot of times we call it Adam's apple or the voice box. And so that's going to have a couple different features there. It's also the area where the thyroid gland is. So the thyroid gland just sits right on the surface, kind of right by these thyroid cartilages here. But this is kind of what they look like. And so this is where the tube is going to split from one tube coming from the oral cavity in the pharynx into two tubes that's going to go to the digestive system and then to the lungs. And so if you look in this picture here, we can see a couple different important features. So one of the features that we see here is this U-shaped bone. It's actually a bone, not cartilage. It's called the hyoid bone. Now the hyoid bone is going to attach to a whole bunch of muscles to hook onto this thyroid cartilage, hook onto the clavicle and other features kind of down in the neck. They also hook onto the tongue. It also hooks onto the tongue, into the chin and the mandible and things like that. And a big part of what the hyoid bone does is it helps move the tongue, helps with swallowing, and it helps coordinate the movements of the epiglottis. And so the hyoid bone is pretty important. And so they always say, I've never taken a self-defense course against like bad guys, but I've heard that they say that in your self-defense classes against bad guys, that if someone's attacking you, you punch them really hard in the throat, it can break the hyoid bone or their thyroid cartilage, and then it collapses that and they can't breathe and then they die. Or at least they choke and they let go of you. So if you ever need that, there you go. This is not only an anatomy tutoring session, but it's also protect yourself. Yes, life lessons. This is very, very, we're learning lots of great stuff here. anyways, from an anterior view, so if I was just facing forward like this and all of the other anatomy around me was taken away, and of course this is larger than normal, than just anatomical. You can see the hyoid bone. Right behind it, you can see the epiglottis, kind of looks like a little tongue sticking up. That is going to flop down when we swallow, and it's going to cover the trachea so that the food then can, or water or whatever, can go posteriorly down into the digestive system. So that's going to be important, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the digestive system. But this idea is really important because if you start getting food and water and stuff that you're drinking going down in your lungs, then there's a lot of bacteria and a lot of kinds of, things like that. You can choke, but you can also get what's called aspirative pneumonia. And so this is really common in people that have like brain injuries or stroke victims or Alzheimer's or older people, because the muscles that coordinate this there's lots of dexterity. They're very fine-tuned and very fine motor controlled muscles that control it. And if they just stop working because there's some kind of injury to the nervous system, then you don't swallow right and you start getting food down in your lungs. And so it can lead to pneumonia, and people can get really sick from it and they can die from it. And of course, you also can choke, and that's not good either. But that's something to watch out for. If you're ever working in a rehab center, you definitely will run into people that have that. And so they give them special diets and they help them with speech therapists and swallowing muscle control and things like that. But anyway, so that's supposed to work. So most of the time it does. It also can kind of get messed up sometimes if you're like drinking milk and your friend does something funny and you start laughing, and then you can choke on your milk and spit it all over the place, and then everyone laughs even more and you feel dumb. But things like that happen if it doesn't work right. You can swallow wrong and you can choke on it, and that's embarrassing. But it's better than dying. So we don't want to die. So the epiglottis then helps control that. So it helps prevent stuff going down in the lungs. Just below the hyoid bone then, you see this cartilage right here. This is called the thyroid cartilage. Thyroid in Latin means shield-like a shield, a knight in shining armor with a shield. So they thought it looked like a shield, which it kind of does. And then right below that is the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage, cricoid means ring-like. So this is the only one of these cartilages that is a full ring. The other ones, the thyroid, the hyoid bone, and these other tracheal cartilages that we'll talk about next, they're only C-shaped. They only go halfway around. They don't go all the way around. But the cricoid cartilage goes all the way around, and we'll talk about why that's important in a second. And then right below the cricoid cartilage, we have C-shaped cartilaginous rings that go all the way down the trachea, and they'll continue into the bronchi to a certain level, and then they'll start to go away. But this is important because the upper parts of the respiratory tract, these tubes that pass the air in and out of our lungs, we want them to always stay open. We don't want them to ever collapse or close. If they ever collapse or close, then that means that we're going to die because we can't get air in and out of our lungs. So those cartilages are hard, and they don't close, they don't smash. They stay there, and that helps keep that tube open all the time so air can get in and out of it really easily. All right, so then if we rotate it around, so this picture here is a posterior view. So it'd be like you looking at the back of me, and all my head and muscles and stuff were removed. You can still see the hyoid bone here. You can see the epiglottis. You can see the back of the thyroid cartilage, the back of the cricoid cartilage, and then you can also see these two little kind of triangular sort of fingernail-y looking things here that are called arytenoid cartilages. The reason why those are important, or one reason why those are important, is because they form a synovial joint with the cricoid cartilage, and they have skeletal muscles that attach to them. And on the other side of them, they also have bands of connective tissue that go across the opening and hook onto the back of the thyroid cartilage. And so the synovial joints and the muscles allow them to rotate. And as they rotate, that tightens and loosens these connective tissue bands that span across that opening. And so then when we move air across them, they vibrate. And by making them tighter or by making them looser, we can change the pitch or the frequency of the vibrations, which is, of course, how we fluctuate our voices and we talk and sing, and a big part of how we communicate. So that's why it's called the voice box, because you have these arytenoid cartilages and the other structures in there that that help control the sound and stuff like that. Anyways, so these are the important features that you're going to see when you talk about the thyroid cartilage. And so make sure that you're familiar with those. I mean, there's a lot of detail that we're not going into, but those are kind of the main features that you want to think about, and probably the things that are the most important for you guys. Maybe just one other little side note really quick before we move on. Sometimes if people have like an anaphylactic situation, or they have something that blocks their mouth or something, sometimes they have to go in and they have to put a hole in here and put a breathing tube in there. And so then that allows you to bypass like the nose and the mouth and stuff like that, and you can still breathe. And so you hear about that, and sometimes that kind of thing happens. Anyways, okay, so then vocal cords. So we kind of already talked about this. So we'll probably skip over this a little bit. So the trachea. Now after we go through the larynx and the voice box, now we go into the trachea. So the trachea is flexible. There's lots of details here. The primary thing that I want to focus on is it splits into two primary bronchi. So that just means the bigger ones, and then those will split into secondary bronchi, and those will split into tertiary bronchi, and so they're getting smaller and smaller. And they have 20 C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage is one of the kinds of cartilage that we talked about last quarter. And they have 20 of these C-shaped rings stacked on top of each other. Again, that keeps the tube open. It keeps it so that it doesn't collapse. And that's important because we want to make sure that the air keeps coming in and out. Okay. So this picture is similar to one we already looked at. So the mouth and the nose, of course, would be up here. And then we go through the pharynx, then the larynx, and then the trachea, the primary bronchi. And then we're going to see smaller branches. And again, the idea is we take this big volume of air, and little by little, we split it into more little pieces. And that makes it so that we have more surface area. So each tiny little microscopic alveoli only has to process a little teeny bit of volume of air. But because we have so many alveoli, as long as our lungs are healthy and we don't have emphysema or something else that's a problem, then each one of those little alveoli can process a lot of air collectively. And that can go into the blood, and that can get a lot of oxygen into the blood. And that's important because that's what we need to make ATP for our bodies. Okay, so if we look at these two pictures, this just shows a cross section through the trachea. So for example, if I was laying down like this and you chopped off my head, which hopefully you don't, and you looked straight on, this is what we'd be looking at. So you can see the C-shaped cartilages. I guess it would be if I was on my back though. But anyways, the C-shaped cartilages, the lumen, and then there's some mucus and some skeletal muscle, and then that's just stacked on top of each other so the tube would continue out. And so that's what that picture shows there. And that just keeps the tube open. All right. So we go from the trachea into the primary bronchi, so right and left primary bronchi. Those split into lobar or secondary bronchi. Those split into segmental or tertiary bronchi. And then those split into interlobular bronchioles. Those split into terminal bronchioles. And each one of these are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Then respiratory bronchioles. Well, I can't see what I'm looking for. But on the respiratory bronchioles, they start doing respiration. So this is the first structure that starts to conduct gas exchange. Alveoli bud from the sides of their walls. And then you form alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, which are groups of alveoli together, and then alveoli. So these are the microscopic sacs that perform gas exchange. And they're just simple squamous epithelium. And then there's like some elastic connective tissue around them to kind of hold them in place. And so we look at this picture. You can see primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi. And then down here, if we make this bigger, now we're seeing interlobular, and then we're seeing respiratory bronchi, and then, respiratory bronchi, sorry, here, and terminal bronchi, respiratory bronchi. And then these groups that look like kind of clusters of grapes, those are the alveolar sacs. And then each one of the grapes is an alveoli. So these little alveoli are kind of like little balloons or little, I don't know, little kind of sacs, and the air goes in and fills those up. And then, like it shows in this picture, just surrounding right around those alveoli, you have a very vast network of capillaries. And so you can get air in and out of the lungs that way really easily. Okay. Oh, this is what I was looking for before. In that other slide. So the cartilage rings disappear at the bronchioles. And so after that, then they just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but the cartilage disappears there. So as the respiratory tubes get thinner, the type of epithelial cells change. So in the upper parts, the larger tubes, we have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium with mucus cells. Then we have simple cuboidal epithelium in the respiratory bronchioles, and then that transitions to simple squamous in the alveoli. And so you see those changes, and of course, this is kind of what we're going to focus on here because that's where we have the actual gas exchange. And you have to have the alveoli there to make that work. Okay. So this picture just illustrates as the air that we're breathing comes in, if we have more oxygen in the air we breathe than there is in the blood, then it will diffuse across the simple squamous of the alveoli, across the simple squamous of the capillary, and then go into a red blood cell. And then the red blood cells go to the body. As the blood comes in, if there's more CO2 in the blood than there is in the air that we're breathing, then CO2 will simply diffuse across the simple squamous epithelial cells of the capillary and across the simple squamous epithelial cells of the alveoli, go into the alveoli. And then that's going to collect together. And of course, when the lungs then collapse, or not collapse, that's not the right word, but what's the right word I'm looking for? When we exhale, then all of that will get pushed out. And so that just kind of illustrates that process. There's more details to how that happens. We'll talk more about like partial pressures and things like that later on. Surrounding the lungs, just like the heart and other cavities in our body, we have serous membranes. So in the case of the lungs, the serous membranes are called the pleura. So we have visceral pleura, which is the simple squamous epithelial serous membrane right on the surface of the lungs. And then right next to it, we have the parietal pleura, which then hooks onto the inside of the body wall. In between those two, we have what's called the pleural cavity. And that's a potential space that's filled with serous fluid. And that creates a viscous, slippery fluid that's very resistant or reduces friction. So every time we're breathing in and out, which we do all day long, every day, hopefully, and the heart right next to it that's pumping, all that movement and motion, we need something to reduce friction so we don't cause tissue damage to our lungs. Again, like we said before, the alveoli are thinner than tissue paper, and they're super fragile. And so we have to be really, really careful with them when we protect them. And one of the things we do to protect them is we create these serous membranes. So it helps prevent those cells from getting damaged and causing problems. Sometimes people get infections in that potential space, and that's called pleurisy. And pleurisy can be very painful and very and not fun. And so you take antibiotics and get better. All right. Okay. So in order then for this process to work, we actually have to get air to our alveoli. And when we talk about air going to our alveoli, the basic concept of this is just like a bellows or like a syringe. So in the case of a syringe, there's a stopper on this end that's airtight, and then there's one opening. So if we draw the stopper back, that increases the volume space here, and the pressure in here drops. In order to compensate for that, the higher pressure outside pushes in to fill the space that we've just created. And then the opposite also happens. So as we increase the pressure, decrease the volume, we increase the pressure, and that pushes the air out. So our lungs basically work in the exact same way. We have a closed system, and there's a flexible membrane down here, and then we have one opening in and out. So the diaphragm is kind of like the plunger from the syringe. So if we drop the diaphragm, then the pressure in here drops and air comes in to replace that low pressure system. And then when the diaphragm goes up, the pressure in here increases, the volume decreases, and the pressure increases and pushes the air out. And so that's primarily how we breathe. And so one of the interesting things about this process is typically when we think about breathing, we think of it as an involuntary process, which it is. Fortunately, we don't have to think about that all day long. I have a hard enough time remembering like people's names and stuff like that. So that'd be terrible. But the cool thing about this that's really interesting is that these are skeletal muscles. The diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, which means it's voluntary. So the way this works is there's kind of a sort of unique sort of system set up here that runs through a reflex arc. And so based on readings that come from all over your body, your brain and your bloodstream and stuff, messages will go to the brain and then to the phrenic nerve. And so if the oxygen levels in your brain or your blood are getting lower, then that will tell the phrenic nerve or the other nerves that respond to this to move the diaphragm up and down faster or deeper or more or something like that. And so we move more air in and out. And then on the other hand, we can slow it down as well. But this is a voluntary process. And so just to kind of illustrate that, there is a reflex, so I don't have to think about it all day long, but it is voluntary. So I can actually hold my breath. And that's really important because every time I drink water or every time I eat something and I swallow, I have to stop breathing for a second or more so that the food and water doesn't go down in my lungs and I choke. And so I can hold my breath. Or when I go swimming with my friends, or if someone throws me in a lake and I have to hold my breath, I can hold my breath. But then also this works on its own. I tell this story sometimes, it's kind of funny. So I have an older brother, and when he was really young, if he didn't get what he wanted, he would hold his breath. And so then my mom would like freak out and she'd give him whatever he wanted. So one day my mom was talking to her pediatrician and she said, this is what my son's doing. And the pediatrician said, well, just let him throw his temper tantrum. Like, it doesn't matter. Once he passes out, he's just going to start breathing on his own again. And of course, that wasn't really what my mom wanted to hear because she was worried about my brother like getting hurt or smash his head on the table or whatever. But that idea is really good. So as long as the system's in place, as long as there isn't damage to the nerves that control the diaphragm, if you pass out because you're holding your breath or something, then the reflex that corresponds to oxygen and carbon dioxide levels and pH and all that stuff in your bloodstream and in your brain and all over your body will start the system on its own, and it will just start going on its own because there's that reflex built into it. So there is an involuntary component that's related to a reflex arc, but it is voluntary also. These are all skeletal muscles, the muscles that control breathing, and that's an important kind of idea. So I think that's kind of cool. Okay, so diaphragm. There we go, breathing. So when we talk about breathing, there's kind of different ways that we breathe. Sometimes we breathe a lot, sometimes we breathe a little, and the depth of how much we breathe is going to vary depending on activity level and so forth. So this graph kind of illustrates these different sort of volumes of air that are going in and out of our lungs. And so the graph over here shows volume in milliliters versus time. And so as time goes, then we're going to see this. And it's repetitive. So what you'll notice is that the same thing repeats over and over again. And of course, that's because we're doing the same thing over and over again. So when we breathe in, we have what's called the inspiratory reserve volume. Well, let's start with tidal volume. So tidal volume is the normal amount of air that I breathe in and out when I'm at rest or just kind of relaxed, just sitting here in class or whatever. I mean, here you're probably really excited, so you're like breathing a lot because anatomy is so cool. So maybe that wouldn't be a good example. But when you're relaxed and you're just kind of chilling with your friends or whatever, Tidal volume is the volume of air that's going in and out of your lungs at that level. So it keeps you going, you're great. If you take a deep breath, for example, you yawn or you go running or you walk up and down the stairs or something, the amount of air that comes in that's more than your tidal volume is called the inspiratory reserve volume. And the amount of air that goes out that's more than the normal air of tidal volume is called the expiratory reserve volume. In the notes, it shows IRV and ERV, and so it abbreviates in that way. The inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume together are also called the vital capacity. And then what you notice down here is there's one more little volume here called the residual volume. Now, the residual volume is the amount of air that stays in your alveoli at all times. It isn't the same air because it gets circulated all the time. So there's new air coming in, it pushes the old air out, but there's always some air in here. So when you think about the alveoli are stretchy. They're kind of like a little balloon. And so if I blow air into a balloon, there's some resistance, but once the balloon fills up, as long as the resistance remains, it will stay inflated. If I let that go, then the balloon will collapse. So that's the same kind of concept here. We always have to have a little bit of pressure in those alveoli to keep them open. If they collapse, then we can't breathe. And so to kind of illustrate this here, this is kind of like, probably every kid has a story that's kind of like this, where when you're in elementary school, you're playing on the monkey bars and you fall and you land on your back and you can't breathe and you're like, ugh, and you're flopping around like a dead fish on the ground. Did it?
I fell off and I fell right into a glass. Oh. I fell not on my back, like face first. Oh. I have a scar right here.
Ouch. Well, horrible. Did it make you not be able to breathe?
Yeah. I couldn't breathe.
Okay. Well, there you go. So, I mean, it's bad you hit your head too, but for this class here, what we're talking about is getting your wind knocked out, of course. And so you hear stories about football players and they get hit, if you get hit in the right way or something, it forces the air out of your lungs. So what happens is the residual volume gets pushed out because it hits you in a weird place in your back or in your diaphragm or in your abdomen or something. And then as soon as the air escapes from those alveoli, they snap shut. So there's other stuff we'll talk about in a second that are also in there with the alveoli that help keep them open too. But if you force that air out, then they snap shut. And then there's no way to get diffusion of oxygen in your blood and stuff. And so then you're like, ugh. And so what your body's doing is it's trying to force air into those little pockets to pop them open again. So just like when you first blow up a balloon, it takes a little bit of extra air to make that stretch go, and then it's easier to blow it up after that. So once you force the air in, then you can start breathing again. But it takes a couple seconds to get that going. And while you're sitting there flopping around, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. And you don't, fortunately, but at least I never did. Haven't yet, at least. But anyways, and so that's kind of the idea here. So this is the air that's associated with getting your wind knocked out. So we have to keep those open, and that helps us be able to breathe. So inspiratory capacity, functional residual capacity, and then total lung capacity is just all of them together. And so those are like kind of your main volumes. And if you look at the previous slide, we sort of skipped over them. This kind of explains this in its own words, and it shows the volumes associated with it. And so you can kind of look at that. All right. So last time that we were together, we kind of ended right around here. We just were talking about the different volumes associated with inspiration and exhalation. And the main ones we talked about were the tidal volume. So tidal volume is like basically the amount of air that goes in and out of your lungs when you're just at rest, just kind of relaxing, watching TV, whatever. If it's not like a scary movie or super romantic or whatever, it's like normal. So you're just breathing normal. If you take a deep breath, the amount of air that comes in that's more than the tidal volume is your inspiratory reserve volume. And then the amount of air that you breathe out when you breathe heavily is the expiratory reserve volume. And then the amount of air that's supposed to stay in your alveoli just to keep the alveoli inflated is called the residual volume. And last time we talked a little bit about this and how like you get your wind knocked out. And when the residual volume is forced out of those alveoli, they just collapse. So as we mentioned before, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but as we mentioned before, the alveoli are basically just simple squamous epithelium, which is tissue that's thinner than tissue paper. I mean, it's super duper thin. And so even just water or anything like that in there will collapse them, because the polar hydrogen bonds between the water molecules is strong enough to just collapse the alveoli. And so you have to have stuff in there to keep them inflated. And so we'll talk about a couple of the strategies that our body uses to keep them inflated. But one of them is you always have to have positive pressure to keep a little bit of air in there to keep them slightly inflated, like a balloon. Okay, so then you have your vital capacity, which is the inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, expiratory reserve volume together. You have inspiratory capacity, which is tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. Functional residual capacity, which is residual volume and expiratory reserve volume. And then the total lung capacity, which is all of them. And so you can kind of see how those relate to each other. You can see over here the volumes associated with them. And of course, that's going to vary a little bit from person to person probably. But those are kind of, and like stages of your life and whatever. But those are kind of generalizations, at least, and kind of the pattern that you see. So this slide talks about it. I kind of use my own words, but this slide here, the previous one to that graph, kind of explains it in the words of the notes. And so you could take a look at those, and it's probably a good idea to learn like what those are and kind of understand what they are. Okay. So one of the other important things when we talk about the respiratory system is that for the most part, the respiratory system is controlled through some regulatory areas in the brainstem. And there are kind of three main areas that are going to help regulate like depth and rate of breathing. And the three main regulatory areas are the pontine respiratory group, the ventral respiratory group, or VRG, and the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG. And so those are the three main regulatory areas. Now, what typically happens is these areas are going to receive feedback from our body. And so based on the levels of carbon dioxide, the pH, the oxygen levels in like your brain and in different parts of your body, so the kidneys, the brain, the carotid bodies in the neck, some of those places are some of the main places. And they'll send messages, but there's others. And they'll send message to the brain, and then the brain will process it and say, oh, the pH is getting too acidic, or the brain isn't getting enough oxygen, or whatever. And then in response to it, the brain will then send a message to these regulatory areas, which will increase depth or decrease depth, increase rate of respiration or decrease rate of respiration, and so forth. Primarily how they work to control the diaphragm is through what's called the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve is one of the main nerves that helps, that stimulates the diaphragm, and that's one of the main breathing nerves. So there's other ones. So we also have intercostal muscles that help with breathing. They help expand the chest and contract the chest when we're breathing really heavily, labored breathing. We also have muscles at the top of the clavicle and the top of the ribs that help lift the rib cage more when you're breathing heavily. And so there's some other nerves that are involved, but probably the main nerve that's involved in that is the phrenic nerve, and so that's an important one to know. But it's through these three regulatory areas. And so if we look at these on the previous slide, it just says the medullary respiratory center contains two groups of neurons, the ventral respiratory group, or VRG, sets basic rhythm of breathing. Dorsal respiratory group, or DRG, modifies activity of ventral group. And then the pontine respiratory groups help set rhythm of breathing by limiting duration of each inspiration. And so those are kind of the main things that are going to happen to make your breathing rate go up and down. And of course, we want it to change based on need and what our situations are. And so in order for this process to work, though, we have to get enough oxygen into our lungs, and there has to be more oxygen in our lungs that will diffuse into the bloodstream. And so they're kind of, when we talk about the movement of oxygen into the lungs and the movement of carbon dioxide out of the lungs, we have to discuss this idea of what's called partial pressure. So partial pressure is a component of two things. So the partial pressure of a gas is the percentage of the gas in the air that we're breathing times the atmospheric pressure. So like its name implies, partial pressure, the amount, the partial or the portion of the air we're breathing that's made up of O2 compared to other gases. So in the air we breathe, typically there's about 21% of oxygen in the air we breathe. And then there's, a certain percentage of carbon dioxide. There's a certain percentage of nitrogen. There's a certain percentage of, all kinds of different gases in the air we breathe. But if the air we breathe has about 21% of oxygen in it, and our atmospheric pressure is, within kind of the normal limits of the surface of our planet, then we can get enough oxygen, and the diffusional gradient will force the oxygen into the blood, or allow the oxygen to diffuse into the blood. And then in contrast to that, if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is higher than it is in the alveoli, compared to what's in the atmospheric pressure, then it will move out and diffuse out of the blood into the alveoli, and then we can breathe it out when the diaphragm compresses on the thoracic cavity. So that idea is really important. And so when you think about this, a lot of times people say, oh, well, if I go climb Mount Everest, there's not as much oxygen there. Well, in reality, the percentage of oxygen on top of Mount Everest is the same for the most part as it is at the ocean, at sea level. But the main difference is that you have different atmospheric pressure. So at sea level, your atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. At the top of Mount Everest, it's lots less than that. I don't know what it is, but probably like 80 millimeters of mercury. So it's a lot less. And so that's what the problem is that you don't have enough atmospheric pressure to make the partial pressure high enough to force it into your bloodstream. And so this is just a really important concept. So if we look at a little picture of this, we'll come back to some of these in a second, but I want to look at this picture right, where is it? Here for a second. Okay, so to kind of illustrate this point, this picture is just showing the blood. So this is a capillary around the alveoli, and this is an alveoli. So first of all, you can see that basically there's just one layer of simple squamous epithelium that make up the alveoli, and then there's one layer right next to it of simple squamous epithelium that make up the capillary wall. So super duper thin. And so as long as the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is higher than it is in the blood, then the diffusional gradient will allow the oxygen to go into the blood and bind to hemoglobin. And as long as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher in the blood than it is in the alveoli, then carbon dioxide will diffuse across those two membranes and get into the alveoli, and then we can breathe them out. And so these partial pressures are important, and that's one of the main concepts that we need to talk about. So if we go back here to where we were at, so what's going to determine our rate of breathing? And so we kind of mentioned this before. So what's going to determine our rate and our depth of breathing is going to be the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood, or the pH of the blood, or the degree of stretch of the lungs, or an emotional state, or level of physical activity, or mechanoreceptors and central and peripheral chemoreceptors, or whatever, a combination of all these things. And so these are regulatory areas that are all over our body, and our body sends messages based on input at any given moment to the brain, and the brain sends the messages to the three main control centers of respiration. And then based on the information that they're getting, it will make the respiration rate go up or down, or deeper or lesser, or whatever, more shallow or whatever. So this idea is really important. So if you think about this for a second, as far as partial pressures go, if the level of oxygen goes down, then that's bad. Or if the level of atmospheric pressure gets too low, that's bad also. So we talked about an example of atmospheric pressure by going like to the top of Mount Everest or wherever. But in this case here, one of the reasons why it's dangerous, I guess, to be inside of a house that's burning, or to have lots of pollution, or to be in an area where there's carbon monoxide or something like that, is because those gases and those substances will outcompete our hemoglobin for oxygen, and they also will replace the oxygen in the air with these other gases that we can't use for metabolism. And so if that percentage goes down significantly, then that could be really dangerous for our bodies. And so both of them are important. So you have to have the right percentage, and you also have to have the right atmospheric pressure. Okay. And then, of course, those other conditions that we talked about as well. So we have chemoreceptors in our body. They're going to regulate or recognize pH primarily, and they can also recognize like carbon dioxide levels and stuff, but mostly pH. So the chemoreceptors are mostly affected by hydrogen ions or by acid. So the main way that our body transports carbon dioxide through the blood is by combining it with water using an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and that makes carbonic acid. So carbonic acid is an acid. So as our CO2 levels go up because we're exercising or because we're, doing something that increases our metabolism, then our pH is going to go down. So we have buffer systems that help regulate that. We'll talk more about those when we get to the kidneys. But we also, one of the ways we help regulate that pH change then is to increase respiration rate. And so as I increase respiration rate, then I get rid of more CO2, and so I don't have as much carbonic acid, and so then my pH goes back up. It doesn't stay so acidic. And so having CO2 or a decrease in pH, which is the same thing as having more hydrogen ions in the blood, then that's one of the things that's going to increase our breathing. So that's an important concept. Going along with that, when we talk about the gases moving through the bloodstream, again, we'll come back to a couple of these, but I want to talk about this first. They're kind of primary ways that our body transports them. So the main way we transport oxygen through the bloodstream is on hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is an iron-containing protein that's found inside red blood cells, and it binds to oxygen as it diffuses across the alveoli into the blood. But this is a really cool concept because the strength of the bond between the oxygen and the heme groups is strong enough to pull it across and help diffuse it across the membrane and then hold on to it so it can transport it through the body. But it's weak enough that when it gets to an area where the oxygen levels are low, that the oxygen can break off and release from that heme group and go into the area where there's low oxygen levels. So this is a really cool little concept where it can hold on to it kind of tight, but it also can release it pretty easily. So 98 to 99% of our oxygen is transported through hemoglobin. The other 2 or so percent of our oxygen is dissolved in the blood. And so that's how oxygen is transported. The main way that we transport carbon dioxide is through the carbonic acid method we just talked about, but we also transport some of the carbon dioxide in our blood just as dissolved gas in the blood, and then some of it will actually bind to red blood cells as well. And so when oxygen moves through the bloodstream and it's released from the heme groups, about 75% of that oxygen remains bound to the hemoglobin. And then it will actually stay in the blood and doesn't release. Okay, and so this is the carbon dioxide one. So carbon dioxide will travel, about 7% of the carbon dioxide we produce travels as dissolved gas in the blood. About 23% of it will actually bind to heme groups in the red blood cells, and the rest transports through the carbonic acid method we just talked about. So, yeah, anyways, okay, so we talked about that. So let's go back again to where we were at. So the alveoli, we talked about them. They're primarily made up of simple squamous epithelium, but there are a couple other types of cells that are intermingled with the simple squamous epithelial cells. So one type of cell that we have in there, in addition to just plain old simple squamous epithelium cells we call type 1 cells, are type 2 cells. So type 2 cells are a special modified form of simple squamous epithelium that produces surfactant. They're also called surfactant cells. It's very tricky. Surfactant cells produce and release surfactant. So surfactant, basically what it does is surfactant breaks down surface tension. So like we mentioned a few minutes ago, this just simply having water in our lungs, which we have to have, so we can't diffuse gases across the alveoli unless we have water in there, moisture in there. So we have to have water in there, but having a little bit of water in there, just the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules actually will collapse the alveoli. And so what surfactant does is surfactant is kind of like an oily substance that breaks down hydrogen bonds. And so then that prevents the water from collapsing the lungs. Sometimes in premature babies, they don't start producing surfactant until they've developed to a certain stage. So if they're born too early, then they can't breathe on their own because they haven't started producing surfactant. So then in some cases, nurses and medical professionals will actually introduce surfactant into their lungs to allow them to start breathing, and then until they can start making it on their own. And so it's kind of something that happens. So in addition to those two types of cells, we also have special macrophages that are down in the alveoli as well. And so there are some macrophages in there. And so if there is particulate or microorganisms or something that bypasses and gets through the cilia and the mucus of our upper respiratory tract, when that stuff gets down the alveoli, that hopefully there's enough macrophages in there to get rid of it. And most of the time it works really well. If you get a really strong infection or you have some kind of immunocompromised system or something because you're super stressed about things like nursing school or something, then in some cases the bacteria can actually grow and you can get like pneumonia. Your body starts producing fluids through inflammation to try to fight off the infection. You get pneumonia, or you can get bronchitis, or you can get all kinds of things. And so, of course, we don't want that happening. So if too much fluid builds up in there, that's bad. If you don't have enough, that's bad. But the normal amounts our body can deal with if we have the other stuff in place to take care of it. All right. So we kind of already talked about the structure of the walls and how they're next to a red blood cell. So in this picture here, it kind of shows the three kinds of cells we were just talking about. So you can see the normal cells here. You can see some cells that produce surfactant, and then you can see some macrophages. And of course, these are just artist renditions, but these cells allow diffusion of the gases. These cells produce surfactant that breaks down surface tension so the alveoli don't collapse. And then these cells will eat any kind of particulate that gets down there and they can get rid of it. And so because these layers are so thin between the red blood cell and the capillary red blood cell, between the capillaries where the red blood cells are and the wall of the alveoli, those gases can just diffuse back and forth as long as we have high enough levels of oxygen and the atmospheric pressure is appropriate compared to what's inside the blood. All right. So this graph then shows what's called the hemoglobin saturation curve, dissociation curve. And it shows percent saturation over here of hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin dissociation, or how easily the oxygen will leave the heme groups at normal body temperature. And so what you notice is that as the partial pressure of oxygen increases, the amount of saturation in the blood actually goes up. But one of the interesting things about this is after you get above about 100, then having a higher partial pressure of oxygen doesn't really make any difference. It's already saturated. And that has to do with like how the heme groups work and so forth. What you'll also see is that our bodies can actually compensate pretty well under different circumstances. And so, for example, in these graphs, you can see how changes in partial pressures of carbon dioxide affect the dissociation curve. And you can see how changes in pH affect the dissociation curve. And you can see how temperature, body temperature, also affects the dissociation curve. And so as the partial pressure of CO2 gets higher, then you lose more oxygen from the red blood cells. The blood isn't as saturated with oxygen. As the pH gets lower, you don't have as much oxygen that's transported in the blood. And as the body temperature gets higher, you don't get as much oxygen transported in the blood. And as it gets lower, you don't release as much oxygen from the blood. And so those levels, just kind of going back to like normal patterns of the body, that we have to maintain homeostasis. And so whether we're talking about pH or body temperature or whatever, those conditions affect a lot of different parts of our body, like metabolism, but they also will affect like how we transport oxygen, how our body, other areas where and how our bodies work in other ways as well. Okay. So this picture here then just kind of shows how we transport carbon dioxide and oxygen. So it shows that the CO2 in the blood is usually about 40 millimeters of mercury compared to 45. And we, most of the time, we combine CO2 with water to make carbonic acid. We'll transport it that way. But there is some dissolved carbon dioxide in the blood. There's also some that actually binds to heme groups in the red blood cells. So as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases as we're going back to the lungs, and it gets up to 45, that's going to be higher in the blood than it is in the alveoli. So then the carbon dioxide will diffuse across those membranes and get into the alveoli. And so that's what this picture is showing here, that you get the diffusion coming out of the blood and into the alveoli. So when the carbonic acid comes close to the lungs, then the body will break the carbonic acid back into carbon dioxide and water, and then the carbon dioxide can diffuse out. Or if it's dissolved in the blood or whatever, it can do that as well. Okay. So as we get older, just like other parts of our body and other systems in our body, we're going to see changes. And so some of the common changes, we kind of already talked about some of these earlier, but sometimes people's cilia will start to die on the upper respiratory tract. Now, a lot of times that's associated with breathing lots of particulates. So in particular, if people are smokers throughout their life, or if they work in a coal mine or something like that, of course, now we have much better, things to deal with, stuff like that. But, if you're breathing a lot of particulate throughout your life, your cilia are going to die. They're going to become less active. In general, they do anyways, but especially if you're breathing a lot of stuff that damages them. So then you can't move it out. So then you can't breathe as well because mucus settles in your lungs. You start to, maybe get pneumonia, or you have to cough a lot or something to get that mucus out and the junk that's trapped in it. So that can lead to gagging and swallowing problems and stuff like that. What also happens as we get older and we start to have dementia, or people get strokes or have other kinds of neurological degradation, that will also affect the fine motor control of our swallowing mechanism. And so as we have trouble with that, then we can't swallow as well. And part of what that means is that the epiglottis doesn't cover the trachea when we swallow like it's supposed to. So then we start getting microorganisms down in the alveoli, and we start getting dirt and other things down there that then can lead to inflammation and cause, again, like bronchitis and pneumonia and stuff like that. Over time, the macrophages in the lungs don't work as well either, and so they aren't as effective. And people, just in general, as we get older, we're more immunocompromised. Our immune systems get weaker because our thymus shrinks, and because, we just wear out after time. The costal cartilages stiffen, postural changes. A lot of times people get hunched over, so they don't have as much volume, can't get as much volume in and out of their lungs. Connective tissues replace the bronchioles, and so that hinders bronchial dilation. If the bronchi can't dilate as much, you can't move as much air in and out. And so So in some cases, the alveoli will actually get damaged, especially for people, again, that like smoke and stuff. If you put a lot of germs and a lot of particulate into the lungs, then it can actually damage the alveoli, and your body will build up scar tissue. So then the lungs lose elasticity, they lose their diffusional ability, and so then that leads to like COPD and problems like that, emphysema and stuff like that. So these are things that happen naturally over time, but there are also things that we can do, behaviors that we can do that actually can make them happen faster. So, probably the classic example is smoking. So if you smoke, these kind of things happen a lot faster and are going to be much more serious and happen sooner in your life than they would normally. Anyways, so that's it for these notes. I mean, we kind of skipped, again, we're just kind of doing a summary of stuff to try to hit the highlights. But feel free to ask me questions if you need something. Just email me or text me or something if I can help you. And then next time we'll start talking about, I think the GI, is next. But we'll talk about that next. Thanks.